everything's going well for everyone? And you guys are on time. Thank you. And the people on the webcast are also presumably on time and in their PJs. Good morning. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I'm the director of the China Environment Forum here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Some of you, I think, are new to the center, so I always like letting you know of our, we're proud of our history, created in 1968 by Congress as a memorial to Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president. Congress decided instead of building a statue or creating a library that they created us. We're under the Smithsonian umbrella, so we sometimes consider ourselves a living museum, right? We bring together government, NGO, business, and researchers, so the policy and scholarly community, to look at foreign policy issues. And the China Environment Forum is 15 years old now. I've been here 13, putting on lots of meetings on energy and environmental issues focused on China. And I have to admit, over the years, I came here as more of a water person and pollution, and I've acquired a lot of understanding of energy. But can I be honest with you guys? In 2009, when Presidents Obama and Hu passed these 9 clean energy agreements, and one of them was the Shale Gas Initiative, my response was, huh? Because back in November 2009, shale gas wasn't really on the front pages of the newspapers here in the States, and not that, the experts knew about it, but a lot of people actually in my network, and so we started, we started researching it. We did our research brief called Shall We Dance a couple of years ago, trying to get our brains around what was shale gas and what were the opportunities for U.S.-China cooperation. And it's been becoming a hotter issue, and in the interim, found out that China's actually got a lot of shale gas, get lots of inquiries, and then I found out that Zhou, he's the IHS CERA director, and he leads their China energy practice specializing on gas and power, that he was going to be in the States. So I cleverly hijacked him. It didn't hurt, did it?
It was great to be in D.C.
It was great. It's great to be in D.C. and to come and talk to us about, the title of the talk is, Shale Gas Revolution in China, Game Changer for Coal. There's a big question mark. There's been lots of news stories on shale gas in China. Maybe it's not going to be come online as soon. We want clarity today, Joshi Joe. You give us some clarity today?
Try my best.
All right, good. And you've probably already sussed that we're formal, not so formal here. So sure. I want, a lot of people in the audience are people who work on energy and environmental issues in China. Got a number of people on the webcast. Welcome to you too. So Joshi Joe is going to kick us off, talking about, I love the title too. I'm an old Beatles fan. Long and Winding Road Ahead for Shale Gas Development in China. And then Brianna Mordick, she's a staff scientist at NRDC, who I think actually I met you early on when I was trying to get my brains around shale gas, and she gave me a wonderful primer on how it worked. You really have to have someone explain it to you. She worked at Anadarko Petroleum for 6 years as a petroleum geologist on projects including shale gas and tight gas and CO2 enhanced oil recovery. And now at NRDC, she was here in the office here and decided San Francisco was a cooler office, so she's now out there. Sadly, but also I hijacked her too. This is a total hijack meeting. People in DC at the same time, UN fun, meant to come together here. And so she's been working with NRDC on their work engaging policymakers in China. So it's not just the technical folks, but talking about concerns about making sure that, if and when shale gas comes online in China, it is clean and green. And you didn't come here to hear me, but I think a lot of you all get your coffee and your bagels settled nicely. And I'd like to invite Joshi Joe to start us off here. You got about 20 minutes to enlighten us, and then and your job is to pay attention, munch quietly, and ask him difficult questions when the two of them are done. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Again, for the opportunity to be here. Last time I was here, I was in school. And always found the forum to be very beneficial. But back then I felt like I was much younger, and we're looking for a lot of knowledge and expertise. So great to be here today again to share some of the things I've been doing the past, 7 years since last time I was here at this forum. This topic is obviously very, very hot. If you live in Beijing and you're in the energy circles, you'll probably receive a shale gas conference notification every week. We've already been receiving them in the spring, and so if you're actually living there, you feel that things are happening, and there's a lot of exuberance about how fast it can happen. Many people hope that it can happen in 5 years' time. I think we have some government officials that also wish that it could happen in 5 years' time. Our belief is that it probably won't. It will probably take a lot longer because of a lot of issues that are still uncertain today. So what I will do today is just to lay some ground on what we've been doing as a company at IHS and CIRA after being in the energy industry for 20 years or so and been watching this issue. And some of the potential obstacles and challenges that we see that must be overcome in order for this important resource to be developed in the country. Let me just kick off on that. Just the key points, if we don't remember anything after leaving today's meeting, I think these are the 4 points I think that are critical.
Is there a quiz?
Might be. You can, next time people come, you can give them a quiz. First of all, shale gas, after all, it fits into the overall natural gas market. So the first key point here is that the gas market in China is still very much supply constrained, and there needs to be a lot more new supply to be brought into the market. And then the idea of a bridging fuel to coal and into a more climate-friendly energy future. So a lot of pent-up demand in the country that must be met before the gas market can really take off. And if we look at shale gas, it is a very important resource base for the country. And whenever you look at different geological studies, they all reveal large potential, resource potential that could be developed. And we do believe that in the long term, shale gas will become a very important domestic gas supply source. But that said, there are geological differences. I think you probably read about many of them. Our belief is that some of these differences and also above ground risks will make probably developing shale gas in China a longer game and also a more costly game, especially in the early stages. And our belief is that this, what we call shale gale at IHS CIRA, probably won't happen in China until the 2020s. And I'll lay out some of the reasoning behind that. First of all, the country is in desperate need for more gas. Today, if you look at the share of gas in primary energy in different countries, you look at China, it's just about 3–4%. Not new story, we all know that coal is king in the country. But if we look at what it could be compared to some of the other countries, there is a lot of potential. It is the biggest energy consumer already today. So even if we just increased the share a little bit, the absolute volume that's needed to come in is huge. So the biggest question today is where are we going to find this gas in the future and use that to replace some of the coal or new coal that will be required going forward. Today, the strategy for the government and for the national companies is to import, just because there's so much demand for gas today that the domestic conventional gas production simply cannot keep up with it. So if we look at this chart, what it shows is that the bar shows the volume of gas that's been pumped into the market on a quarterly basis. Back in 2007, most of the gas supplied are domestic conventional gas production. So these are basically gas produced by the 3 national oil companies. But that was also the time when the government realized that we needed more gas and there is a pent-up demand in the market that must be met. And since then, the national oil companies started signing import contracts, both through LNG contracts with countries like Malaysia and Australia and Qatar, as well as pipeline imports. And if we look at the share of imports in the gas mix today, it's already 30%. And that increased from just barely 5% 6 years ago. So what this means is that the country is resorting to very, very expensive gas supply. Asia Pacific has the highest LNG price in the world, linked to oil prices, which makes the price that much higher. So if I give you a number, Henry Hub today in North America is about $3 per million BTU. In Asia, the contract prices are between $12 and $15 landed. And then you have to obviously regasify that and then put it in the market. So very expensive gas coming to the market today. There's every reason for the government and for the companies to try to develop domestic shale resources. And particularly if the resource base is potentially large. So what we have done at IHS CIRA, we embarked on a journey about 2.5 years ago. And we started this study called Unconventional Frontier for all of our clients. And this utilizes the very strong upstream geological and databases that we've been developing the past 50 years in IHS. And that includes a lot of the geological data from some of these countries. And these are the countries that we believe will be the frontier regions outside North America that could see a potential upside for shale gas. Obviously, China is a very important one. And by today, we've gone through all of them and assessed all the potential. But again, there are many, many differences between North America and all of these countries. And the more we look at it, the more we realize how unique North America is in its market structure, in its landscape of competitive markets, and also the geology. So today what I'll do is take out the China piece a little bit and then share with you some of the findings that we've been going through the past year. What we've done was we mapped over 70 different shale play areas in the country. That includes mostly plays in what we call the greater Sichuan Basin and also the Tarim Basin in the northwest in Xinjiang. And these two areas are the most prospective in terms of geological resources. And for each of these, what we call the 70 or so sub-play areas, we've assessed a variety of geological risks in looking at it, and then used US analogs to do the cost estimate. For example, if one play in the Sichuan Basin is similar in geological conditions of the Barnett Shale in Texas, then we would use, for example, the same number of fracking vehicles that will be required. Or if it's deeper, then how much more do you have to spend in drilling to deeper formations? So we've gone through an exercise that's, I think, the best anyone can do at this time before you actually start drilling a well, and made our estimate. What we found out was, I think unsurprisingly, you've read about it, resource base, what we call gas in place, that's even it's much bigger than what we have here in this country, in North America. And it's spread across multiple geographies. So as you can see here, the Tarim and the Sichuan Basins each account for about 1/3 of the total GIP. That's in trillion cubic feet. And if we look at the geological age of the actual reserve, we see it's also spread across a variety of geological ages in underground. So overall, we are very optimistic about the resource base after we aggregated all the play areas up. And we do believe that in the long term, these areas will be developed. And what I would caution is, even if one or two of these play areas get developed, it would cause a huge change in the gas market. And that's how the US got started earlier on, just a few years back. This is just an example of the geological mapping of the greater Sichuan Basin. Particularly if we look at a lot of the drilling activities today, most of them are in this basin. Today, the country's drilled about, I think last count was 60 horizontal wells. This was last year. Is that enough? No. The US has tens of thousands of wells to actually be certain about the resource base. So today, whatever we hear of those 60 wells, the results are not indicative. They cannot speak for the overall quality or the cost picture of shale gas. So whatever you hear from those drilling activities today cannot be taken as an indicator of what could happen. Which is, it just adds to the uncertainty of what could happen and why I have this title, Long and Winding Road. It will take a long time before we get to the thousands of wells of these highly, probability plays, and then to get to a more certain future. So usually what we do for each of the play areas, our geologists would look at five characters. Brianna is probably familiar with some of this. Maybe you're tired of this already in the past. So you look at the depth of the shale formation, the pay thickness. A pay is basically how thick that shale rock is underground. So the thicker it is, the more likely you can frack and then get the gas out. And then the maturity of the rock, kerogen quality, that correlates with the organic content in the rock, and then the gas content. So these are the 5 main criteria we use, and we use the spider web to look at the risk of each of the plays. So for example, the Longmaxi play in Sichuan, it's decent quality. Is it like Barnett or the Marcellus? No. But if you actually start drilling into it, you may find something that's promising. And the whole idea of shale gas development is essentially how to find what we call the sweet spots. You know, if we think about conventional gas drilling, you have a reservoir. I'm trying to be an expert here, but Brianna probably can correct me. Yeah. You have a reservoir like this, and it's underground. Once you drill into it, gas is all there. So it just pumps out. And better geological work, seismic work, will help you find those reservoirs. Whereas shale, they're not like embedded in here like this. They're all through the rocks, embedded in the tight rock formations. So a lot of it is you have to drill as many wells as you can to assess it. I was just in Texas last week. One of the play areas it's one of the most productive areas today is the Eagle Ford. And the Eagle Ford, there was one area when we look at the map where they drilled 26 holes, and each of them would cost you $5 to $6 million. And there was nothing. They packed up and left and went drilling somewhere else. So these things happen in the industry, and that's why in North America there was success, because there was hundreds of independent companies, and Anadarko would be counted as an independent as well, to drill this and then to increase the probability of finding the sweet spots. Whereas in China today, it's 3 national companies drilling most of the wells. And I'll discuss a little bit some of the other participants in the market. So what we found in the end, adding up all the volumes from those 70-odd plays and did the analog-based cost analysis, what we found, this is what we call a supply cost curve in the industry. What this shows is the horizontal axis is total volume of gas in place resource. So if you look at this chart, the resource base in China is larger than the US. And we got about 4,500 trillion cubic feet that could theoretically be there. And the y-axis is the likely cost associated with getting each cubic foot out. So for this chart, if you read it, the first 1,000 cubic feet, if you look at the China chart over here, if you look at just the first 1,000, that means that it costs just over $3 per MCF 1,000 cubic feet, about the same as million BTU. That means it's relatively economic. It's relatively cheap to get that out. And many may point out that, well, China is actually cheaper once you get to the higher end of it. But if we think about the volumes, I think for many people not in the industry, we don't know how big these volumes are. If we look at that, the 500 trillion cubic feet, that's enough to supply the US for 20 years today. So just that, and that means that that's enough to supply China for over 100 years. So forget about all that up there. If we only just got this out, it's a shale gas revolution. And so what we're focused on is really near term, what can realistically be drilled and be produced in this area, and whether or not those sweet spots where cost levels are relatively low, the volumes are relatively large, can actually be found, and how long would it take to find those sweet spots? Any questions? Should I take questions now or do some? I just want to make sure that this is a geological part.
My shale gas thing fell down. That was weird. Some question, but actually we need, because we're on webcast, unless you can yell really loud. Here you go. Just need a mic. Thanks for pausing there, because it's.
Yeah, this is the part where people could get confused, and if I continue now, people don't understand the first part, then.
Should be on. Oh, sorry.
Hello. My question is...
Oh, and say who you are since you...
Zhongmin Wang, Resource for the Future. It was reported that the current cost of drilling a well in China several times higher than a typical well in the US. But here you have a figure that shows very similar.
Great question. So whenever you start the exploration process, costs are always higher. This is after it's already getting started at the commercialization stage. So like US today, the cost of each cubic foot is much lower than what it was 10 years ago when they started the exploration efforts.
So this is like after 2020?
This is after 2020.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just for me to add, when we were first doing it in the States, in the initial exploratory, how expensive was it?
It would be similar. It would be
Like
2 or 3 times as expensive as it is today. I just mentioned that today in the U.S. costs $5 to $6 million to drill a well. 10 years before, you would be looking at 2 or 3 times that figure, because people have been improving the efficiency levels of these drilling activities. When we were speaking with one of the independents last week in Houston, they already, just the past 2 years, reduced the water consumption by half. This industry is highly innovative. And that's one thing that I can't emphasize more. It's, after being in the industry for the past 5-6 years, you can see how people innovate their way out of it. We've been talking about peak oil for how many decades? We don't see a peak. It's North America oil production increased for the first time in 6 decades. So the technologies were all there, and the industry, I think, will continue to innovate and take on challenges such as water, and continue to supply the energy demand as long as there is demand for it. So, any other questions before I continue here?
Kevin Tu from Carnegie Endowment. My question is, the marginal cost of shale gas production seems pretty low. I'd like to know what's the lowest end of this figure come from? Which gas basin are we talking about?
This is the entire 70 play areas. So every step you see, that's a play. So like there's one play that costs, just in that play, there's about 500 TCF that could come out. So we did a cost analysis for that. So if we need to mine that out, how many fracking vehicles you need, how many wells you need to drill approximately, all those cost estimates, will put it into the cost model.
My question is, if we go to certain gas basins, such as Chongqing, there are too many mountains around. It's extremely difficult to realize economy of scale.
Yeah. So what we've done is, for a lot of those areas, they don't even have roads in them. So we actually built into the capital cost, the cost to construct roads into the mountainous areas. I'll show you a picture later of the existing infrastructure. If you're in Texas, railroads, everything is there. In these mountainous areas, you have to build roads into the mountains. So we have to factor all of that in. But again, that cost does not include the infrastructure, the capex at the very front end. This is basically the cash cost after production has started, and that's how the price will be set. Prices are not set by the upfront capital investment, the very beginning. And it's the same thing in the US. You're talking about the cost of producing each cubic meter at the time.
Any other lingering questions? Oh, good, thanks.
Thank you. I'm Michael from US EPA. My question on your cost estimates, does that include the whole life cycle from production to transmission, distribution, gathering and boosting, or is that cost estimate strictly production?
This is at the wellhead.
Okay, thank you.
So, okay.
Good deal. Good question. And ping-ponging over here, that's good. I am feeling smarter already.
Jane Nakano with CSIS. Just a quick question. What's the recovery rate you apply? And not necessarily specific to this one, but when you're talking about the resource level assessment, is it pretty close to what, say, the U.S. Geological Survey has been using to assess?
It's similar. So, I mean, in this area, we'll basically assume that if every cubic meter of the total gas in place is produced, how much it will cost. I mean, I think by the time you get to the $10 range, nobody will be producing that. They're going to drill and realize it's expensive. They pack up and leave. It's what's happening in Texas today. When it's super expensive, those dry gas wells have been shut in, and you're moving on to the wet place. Okay, I'll move on. The challenges. So I think we already addressed some of those questions on this topic. What are the key challenges? There is subsurface issues. There is the topographic issues that you mentioned. But our belief, again, is that in terms of technology innovation, the industry will overcome them over time. The geology, the topography, building roads, these are not things people haven't done before. And if China's importing gas at $15 per million BTU, the latest cargoes from Qatar arrived in the Chinese ports at $20 per million BTU. It's insane. If prices today are at that level, there's no reason they should not be developing this today. Even if they have to build the roads, even if it's in the mountainous areas, it will increase cost, but not at $20 per million BTU is pretty high. So if we look at what's happening today, this is from our upstream activities service. This is the greater Sichuan Basin. And the areas in red and green are already areas up here. That's fields developed by the national oil companies. The boxes, little boxes, are all wells that's drilled. This is up to October 2012. As you can see here, not that many wells drilled today. It's still a very, very early stage of the development, and most of those are drilled by the national companies in conjunction with generally an international partner. What's happened, you heard about the second round tendering of the leases. What's happened was the government started handing out leases so that there will be better resource assessments in the area. So if you look at the leases, the second round leases are the green squares. These are the blocks that are being handed out to the left, to the right. And these are areas that have not previously been explored by the national companies. So one of the key purposes of the government at this stage is to allow many people to go in and invest and drill many wells, as many wells as it can, especially in areas where the geological work hasn't really been done in depth. So these are the areas that various companies are starting to explore. By starting, I mean on paper today, really, finding a partner, because I'll show a slide. None of them have ever drilled a conventional gas well. Forget about unconventional. So they're completely new as you and me to the industry. Some of the key differences I'll highlight here. I mentioned earlier that the more we look at what's happening in the U.S. and the overall market conditions and regulatory framework, the more unique we see the United States in the gas market. I just list out 4 key differences between the two countries. Mineral rights. Here, anybody who owns a house, a farmer who has a piece of land, everything from the core of the earth to the skies is theirs. And they can invite anybody in to do the development. So a lot of the independents, they can go in and talk to these farmers and say, I'm going to drill on your land for 3 years. I'll give you this much money. And when the gas comes out, then you have a share of X% of the gas production. Well, if you're a farmer, you probably want to do that. Whereas in China and as well as many other countries, the mineral rights are nationally owned. So there is an incentive issue there. You have to get government to allow you to drill there. We've seen this in Europe already, in France, in Poland. In these countries, it's the same thing, nationally owned, and you always have to get the permission from the national government on your mineral rights and the leases. And then you have upstream pricing mechanism, completely market-based mechanism here that responds to supply and demand, whether or not it's short-term contracts or slightly longer-term contracts. In China, the prices are regulated by the government. So whenever anybody wants to invest in upstream, it's harder for them to get the price visibility into the future, because that's how you get your revenues. In the end, you're still subject to what the government says the price levels would be, and you'll be lobbying the government to try to increase or allow higher return rates. And then pipeline access. This country has one of the best connected pipeline network in the world, and they're all transparent pricing. All of us can go to the Texas Railroad agency and look at how pipelines are priced. There's a formula, everything's clear. Anybody can access it, It's open access rule. Whereas in China today, a lot of the pipelines are owned by the national companies. The pipeline tariffs are again regulated by the government in conjunction with the pipeline operator. And coverage areas are yet to be expanded. So whether or not, if you have gas coming out, it's uncertain whether or not you have a way to distribute it. And then investors. Shale gas started here because of independence. Hundreds of them innovating, competing with each other, and finding the best solution to these geological challenges that they faced. And that's why after 15 years, we had a shale boom here in this country. If we look at a lot of other countries, generally there's a very strong dominant player. That's the national oil company. And even if you want to introduce other players into the shale gas upstream, which is what the government is doing today in China, the number of them, even though it could be very high, they've never done anything in the upstream. They don't know how to organize an exploration and production company. They don't know who Halliburton or Schlumberger is that could help them with their work. So it's a very early stage, and it just increases the time that's needed to go up the learning curve. So this is the Chinese gas market. It's maturing rapidly. You have key producing basins, the blue bits, and then you have a reasonably well-connected national pipeline network. For a market its size, I think this infrastructure is still developing pretty fast. And then you have LNG importing terminals along the coastal regions. So these are all the supply that's coming into the market. That's just not enough today. And the need for continued infrastructure expansion as well as supply expansion is huge. But if you compare that to this, it's two completely different pictures. This is the pipeline network in North America. If you look at the Gulf Coast, you can't even see where they are. It's because there's lines everywhere, all over the place. And if you're a producer, you're drilling in Texas, you really don't care too much whether or not a particular location you think is highly prospective will be connected to pipeline. Because even if it doesn't at the time, you can build a line a few kilometers away, and you probably find a line to connect to. And this is one of the biggest differences that's existing, not just between this country and China, but between this country and many other countries in the world. You have a network that is highly connected. It's a continental market. You can ship the gas anywhere in the country. And you have very, very high transparency over the gas flows. And people are doing deals everywhere. So that's one of the key differences we have. And then we mentioned the terrain challenges. We had two pictures. One on the left is the Barnett Play in Texas. So you see roads, railroad, flat, everything is there. So this is a drilling site that there was in the Barnett. And you can get your gas anywhere. You can get your equipment in very easily. The right-hand side is one of the drilling sites in the Sichuan Basin. The first time I saw the picture, I looked at, these are the fracking vehicles here. I thought they fell off the cliff. They are operating along these slopes, right? And then, as we mentioned earlier, you have to build roads into these areas. There was no roads before. So the upfront capital cost is so much higher to develop these areas than what you would see in Texas. Okay.
Reminds me of the joke, when the Chinese farmer tripped and fell out of his field, right? In Sichuan, the farmers sometimes farm pretty steep too.
The same thing, yeah. And they're walking without all the liquids that's contained there. Okay, and then the third one I highlight the price signals. If you look at the U.S. today, we have the red line is shale gas production in BCF, billion cubic feet per day. And then the blue line is hub price. And you can see a very strong correlation to what supply and demand could do to prices. And this is the visibility people need. People, every company, when you're in upstream production, you have your strategic planning division that will try to foresee what the future may look like. And they have a wealth of data that they can base on to do their price forecast. They may do it wrong, but they have something to base it on. Whereas if you're in a regulated environment, the only thing you can base on is what the government thinks. And we all know how easy it is to predict politics. So this is one of the key reasons why there's good incentive for investment in China versus in the U.S. versus China. There are challenges that must be overcome on the pricing side, and letting go of pricing authority and the pricing regulation is a very difficult thing for any government. And liberalization is a process that takes effort, not just when the central government figure says we need to liberalize. There's very strong interest groups all over the place in the economy that could be against it. So it's very much a political battle. So this shows the most liquid part of the Chinese gas market. This is the land-based LNG. So those are LNG loaded onto trucks, trucked into different parts of the country. And if you can observe here, the prices in different regions are relatively flat. There's very little change. Compared to this, you have ups and downs on a daily basis. And then it reflects how much supply is coming in, how much people are burning. Whereas here, you see very little fluctuation on price signals. And a lot of that is because these are in some way connected to a regulated price along the pipeline. Okay. Last point here, I think, on the companies that are drilling today in the country. If we look at who won the blocks in the second round, these are all public information. It's just on the website. Anybody can look at it. If we look at them, who are they? They're power companies. 5 of them are power companies. 6 of them. You have 5 mining companies, coal companies, basically, a trading company, and a city gas company. So the closest to the industry is the city gas company, and they don't know how to operate in the upstream. The power companies don't. The mining companies don't. These are all completely new players in the upstream sector, and you're expecting them to get the gas out in 5 years. I think it's quite ambitious of a goal to think that these companies will invest in that kind of scale. And many of them have very different risk appetite. For example, the power companies, what's their risk so far? They have a regulated power tariff by the government, and coal price is the only risk they have to manage. The tariff, they're very certain of what revenues they will get in the future. Mining companies, they have to manage some of the mining risk and the prices for coal, but by and large, they're basically in the seller's market the past decade. So these are players that don't know how upstream risks are managed, and how that if you drilled 30 wells and spent hundreds of millions of dollars, you may not get anything. Those are the kinds of risks that must be understood. And I think one potential larger risk for the whole drilling, the shale gas industry, is when these companies realize that after 3 years' time that they're not getting any money back, they may not have an interest in developing the shale plays anymore. And you won't have nearly as many companies going into the market. So that's one of the key differences when we think about who are doing the work. And I think that's pretty much the presentation. Here's the contact information if you have any questions later.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Let's have some applause here. We're gonna. Can we wait till after Brianna to open up for full questions? Is there like one burning? He's like, oh, in the back. Okay, one while I'm changing slides. That's all you get.
Yep. Paul Rieg with the World Resources Institute. I had one question about the estimates. Do they include coal bed methane into the estimates?
You mean the chart we show, the supply cost curve? Yeah, the coal bed methane is in there, and they're generally at the higher end.
Okay. The other one.
Shale is the cheaper one.
Gotcha. The other question also related to the estimates is does the cost include the additional cost to access water in areas where there currently isn't water? You might be competing with other energy producers for those water resources.
In northwest China, we have a infrastructure built in for a water pipeline, for example, to get the water based on current water prices. in Sichuan Basin, we include the water prices, but we generally regard Sichuan as pretty water rich and not as big of an issue for water.
Okay. Thank you.
We're gonna dive into that more in the Q&A. All right, Brianna. This is the first time I've ever had someone have it's a black background. Was that a subliminal message, or you wanted to get the coal?
I've just been told it's easier on the eyes to look at a black background.
All right, good.
You guys be the judge of that. So thank you, Jennifer, for having me, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak about this today. I want to go over what the U.S. experience has been in about the past 10, 15 years in terms of the environmental risk and environmental impacts. I'll mostly be talking about the upstream production sector impacts. But before getting into that, I want to talk just briefly about what role, if any, natural gas can play in helping to curb global warming. So scientists agree that if we want to keep off the worst effects of global warming, we need to keep the temperature increase to about 2 degrees C. Under current policies, world GHG emissions have us on track for about a 6 degrees C rise in temperature. And so scientists also agree if we want a 50% chance of achieving a 2 degree C rise, we need to keep atmospheric CO2 concentrations below 450 ppm. So there's obviously a lot of challenges in achieving 450 ppm. One of those is that currently about 80% of the emissions allowable to achieve 450 are locked in with current infrastructure. You can see the distribution of where those emissions are locked in. But not surprisingly, a big chunk of those locked in emissions, as well as a significant chunk of the remaining emissions, are from coal. And so from that perspective, since natural gas, when it's burned for electricity, generates about half the emissions of coal, natural gas can potentially play a role in helping to give us some more room to maneuver in order to achieve 450 and keep global temperatures from rising above 2 degrees C. But studies also show us that natural gas still only has a limited role to play in the near to medium term in achieving that. Somewhere around 2030 to 2040, depending which studies you look at, natural gas use will need to peak as well. So it's a relatively short bridge. Obviously, there are a lot of ways to skin the cat and achieve these different scenarios, but even so, natural gas, we think, probably has a limited role in helping to achieve climate goals. Carbon capture and sequestration can obviously help extend that time frame and give us more room to maneuver in order to get renewables and efficiency in place. But it's just important to keep in mind when we're thinking about what shale gas and what natural gas in general can do for us is it does have a limited role if you want to achieve climate goals. So I want to talk about what the U.S. experience has been in terms of environmental risk. Obviously, oil and gas extraction is an industrial process. Whether it's conventional oil and gas extraction or shale gas or tight oil, there are environmental risks throughout the production chain. It's to water, to land, communities, air emissions. There are a variety of risks and there are a variety of solutions to help reduce those risks. In the U.S., as in other places, obviously, the shale revolution kind of caught people by surprise, and the people that were caught by surprise include regulators. So the technologies that were used to get shale gas and tight oil out of the ground advanced much more rapidly than the regulations that were in place to control those risks. And a lot of states and our federal regulations through the Bureau of Land Management were written 20 to 30 years ago. They haven't been updated. States are starting to take incremental steps towards updating their regulations. But in the meantime, there have been significant impacts in the U.S. so far. And I want to kind of talk at the high level about some of the biggest risks, but where we also have the technology and the knowledge to significantly reduce those risks on the ground. So the first is air emissions. There are greenhouse gas and toxic and hazardous air emissions throughout the production, transmission, distribution chain. They come from a variety of sources, from the water that flows back to the surface after hydraulic fracturing, from the equipment that's used to dehydrate the gas, to compress the gas, pipeline leaks. And it ranges from leaking to intentional venting to intentional flaring with different amounts of impacts depending on the exact source of the gas. The EPA has two different methods for looking at greenhouse gas emissions. One is the top-down inventory that they produce every year, and the other is the greenhouse gas reporting rule. For the first time, the oil and gas industry was required to report under what's called Subpart W of the greenhouse gas reporting rule. And so that information was just recently released, as well as the 2013 greenhouse gas inventory was also recently released. The inventory it's the 2013 inventory, but it's for the year 2011 is the most recent reporting year, showed approximately 139 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent from natural gas systems. The Subpart W inventory was higher than that. It showed 225 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent from oil and gas systems. Now, there's obviously differences in the way that those are reported. The reporting inventory also takes into account combustion emissions for the sector, and the greenhouse gas inventory does as well, but they're reported in different places. But you can tell from those numbers, and if you've followed the debate at all, there's just a huge knowledge gap in what exactly these emissions are. Studies have shown, that the EPA's numbers would put leakage and greenhouse gas emissions at somewhere around 2% of production. But we've seen studies that show that emissions are somewhere as high as 8 or 9% of production. And so going back to the role that natural gas can play in climate, those emissions start to erode the advantage that natural gas has over coal. Again, depending on which study you look at, if you keep emissions below about 3%, you see climate advantages relative to coal immediately. The higher the leakage rate, the longer those benefits are pushed off. And if you get to somewhere around 8 or 9%, the advantage to coal is completely eliminated. So controlling these air emissions is extremely important. The good news is that there are existing technologies and existing pieces of equipment that can control these emissions. We know exactly how to do it. We know how to get the emissions down. In the U.S., in some cases, it's been a matter of cost. A lot of the things that you would do to control these emissions are replacing outdated pieces of equipment. Obviously, that has an upfront cost associated with it. But the other good news is that you're capturing your product when you install these pieces of equipment. When you're eliminating emissions, eliminating venting, that's product that you can sell now rather than release to the atmosphere. So, the U.S. has a program, EPA has a program called Natural Gas Star, which is a voluntary program for operators to adopt a lot of these technologies that can reduce their emissions. It's been an incredibly successful program. And the EPA also just recently passed their new source performance standards and national emissions hazardous air pollutants rules for the oil and gas sector. It doesn't regulate methane directly, unfortunately. It only regulates VOCs and air toxics. But that will be a step towards controlling those emissions. We think the rules in place will control about 10% of existing emissions, but operators are also moving towards controlling these emissions, and we hope to see additional rules in the future to help control those. One of the other big areas of risk is in well construction. So, you can see the well itself is the one piece of equipment that physically touches both your groundwater and the hydrocarbons and anything you inject down that well. So fracturing fluids, acids, anything that goes down there. And so a lot of the high profile cases of water contamination that have been reported in the US have been a failure of well construction. So if you've heard about Dimock, Pennsylvania and the methane in groundwater there, Pavilion, Wyoming, even though the results aren't complete yet, well construction played a role in that incident. In Garfield County, Colorado, where they also have widespread methane contamination of drinking water, well construction played a role there. And so there are a lot of steps to getting this process right. Right now, the state regulation is incredibly variable in how to do this process correctly. And one of the other factors, of course, is this is, a big chunk of the cost of drilling the well. When in the U.S., since the minerals are privately owned, there's a rush at the beginning, right? They want to tie up those mineral leases, and a lot of these contracts, you have to drill a well in order to retain the lease. And so things are done very quickly. Sometimes they're not always necessarily done correctly, and it's led to a lot of significant impacts in the U.S. Well construction starts with the drilling of the well. You have to choose the fluids properly. You have to be testing properly as you go. And then the well itself, the key is isolation. So you have to set the casing in the right place, the steel pipe that goes into the well, and it has to be cemented properly. A lot of the methane intrusion issues we've seen across the country, it's not been an issue of the gas that comes from the producing zone getting into water. It's shallower gas formations that they've failed to isolate in the wellbore. So that was the case in Dimock, Pennsylvania. So it wasn't the gas coming from here necessarily, but if this formation here contains gas, if they weren't cementing the pipe over that formation, the gas can then migrate vertically and get into drinking water. And this is something, again, where a lot of these the solutions of the technology exist to drill and construct these wells properly. In the U.S., it's been a matter of getting updated, modern regulations in place, and then, of course, enforcing those regulations. And then another big area of impacts has been related to wastewater handling. So the natural gas and oil industry generate huge amounts of wastewater, around several 100 billion gallons per year. This wastewater has a huge range of compositions. It can be nearly fresh all the way up to many times saltier than seawater. It contains naturally occurring radioactive material. It contains heavy metals. It obviously contains hydrocarbons. It contains whatever chemicals were pumped down the well for hydraulic fracturing. And so there's sort of two streams, although sometimes they're kind of thought of as one. One is what's called flowback, which is the water that comes back to the surface after hydraulic fracturing. The other is what's generally referred to as produced water. And so that's water that's just naturally present in the subsurface that is co-produced with oil and gas. And so when that comes back to the surface, it obviously needs to be handled and disposed of properly. In the U.S., the wastes uniquely associated with oil and gas production, which would include this produced water, are exempt from our hazardous waste provision laws. It's an exemption in the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. So regardless of the content or the hazardousness of that waste, it is not treated or handled as hazardous waste. One of the most significant impacts over the years has been from the use of pits. So what they do is they dig an earthen pit in the ground. It may be lined or not lined. And when those fluids come back to the surface after hydraulic fracturing, they're stored in a pit. Those tend to leak. They tend to overflow. And one of the biggest problems is that, once these fluids get into the ground and get into drinking water, it's very difficult to remediate. The U.S. Geological Survey did a multi-year, multidisciplinary study in Oklahoma looking at produced water spills, and they found that even after 60 years of natural attenuation, the salts and metals from produced water are still in the ground. So handling this properly is just incredibly important because it's so difficult to clean up this type of contamination. So again, we know that there are better ways to handle these fluids than storing them in open pits at the surface. They can be contained in closed containers. That also just helps with what you do with it next. Obviously, this waste needs to be transported somewhere for final disposal. If you store it in closed containers, it's easier to ship it. It also helps control air emissions because gas and other volatile organic compounds degas off this water when it comes up. So there are smarter and better ways to handle it. Now, there are many options for what you can do with that water once it comes back up. In the U.S., 90% of wastewater from the oil and gas industry is re-injected back down an injection well. And again, because of the exemption from our hazardous waste laws, the rules that govern the type of injection wells that are used for oil and gas waste are much weaker than the other classes of wells, and definitely much weaker than the class of well that is used to handle hazardous waste. And this has also had impacts over the years, of course, water contamination, and impacts to drinking water. Now, that being said, subsurface disposal is probably the most successful way to deal with this waste. The other methods are much less environmentally friendly, things like putting it into large commercial pits and just spraying the wastewater into the air to evaporate it, surface spreading it on roads, a variety of ways. So overall, underground injection has been a pretty successful way to handle these wastes, but it does, again, is another area that needs to be regulated and enforced properly. So this has been another topic that's been important in the U.S. and obviously a lot of interest in China is how do you reduce your freshwater use and what's a better way to be handling this wastewater. Hydraulic fracturing uses several million gallons per well in the U.S. And that's typically freshwater. And some percentage of that water may come back to the surface. In the U.S., it ranges, from as little as 10%, maybe up to 80%. The problem, though, is that it's a consumptive use of water, right? So that water is now contaminated. It can't go back into the water cycle. Like with, agriculture, obviously the water is eventually getting back into the water cycle. With hydraulic fracturing, it's being injected back into the subsurface. So you're not getting that water back into the system. And as I was just discussing, obviously this is an industry that generates a huge volume of wastewater. So this is a topic that's been at the forefront of people's mind right now, and it's a really emerging area for technology. They're starting to see the synergy between, okay, we have these huge volumes of wastewater. We also have very large freshwater needs. Can we start to use that wastewater instead of using freshwater? So there's a couple of things that people are doing. One is that flowback and produced water can be treated and then can be reused for future hydraulic fracturing events. And there's a range of treatment options that are used, and maybe multiple processes are needed to remove all the different constituents. That water can then be either, like I said, reused or recycled for fracturing fluid or for drilling fluid. It's also sometimes used for what's called beneficial reuse. If they can get it clean enough, it can be used for agriculture or industrial purposes, and it can also be used for enhanced oil recovery. One of the issues with cleaning up the water and reusing it is that then generates a volume of the concentrated waste, and that also needs to be disposed of properly. Again, that's exempt from the United States hazardous waste provisions, and so that's a concern. Is obviously reusing and recycling this water is great, but the residual waste needs to be handled properly. Another option is that they're starting to find new chemical formulas or also by dilution to just reuse this water without treatment. Sometimes they'll just add it to a new volume of fresh water, so just to dilute it. But companies are also really invested in looking at ways to develop chemicals. The issue is that the chemicals that are added to the fracturing fluid, if the water's not fresh, it can result in unwanted chemical reactions. And so companies are starting to look at new ways. What can they be doing so you can use that water with less treatment? And another sort of piece of that is that people are also starting to look at alternatives to using water for hydraulic fracturing. There are some technologies that already exist, including energized fracs and gas fracs. An energized frac is where they use carbon dioxide or nitrogen mixed with water to create a foam. The advantage of an energized frac is that it can carry a proppant, so it can carry the grains of sand that keep the fractures open. A straight gas frac cannot carry a proppant, and so that's a disadvantage to that. These haven't seen a whole lot of use in the U.S., and typically they're only used where necessary. Some of these shale formations are incredibly sensitive to water, and you get a lot of swelling and unwanted reactions if water touches these formations. So typically energized fracs and gas fracs have only been used as necessary. They haven't been as effective in producing hydrocarbons. It doesn't create as effective of a fracture network as a water frac. Another technology that we've seen in the U.S. is propane fracs. So we're actually using liquefied propane gas. It's injected as a gel, so it can hold a proppant. But then when it flows back to the surface, it flows back as a gas. So it can just be put into the regular production stream. And again, this has seen limited use in the U.S. From the early reports we've seen, it has been successful. But again, it has had limited use. Obviously, there's a cost associated with propane. I think, there's also been some safety concerns with using propane as the fracturing fluid. And another thing we've started to see is the use of acid mine drainage or other industrial wastewaters as the base fluid instead of fresh water. And again, this has also had a very limited application so far. In some cases, obviously, you would need to treat this water just like with the flowback or produced water in order to use it. But these things are starting to emerge. Although I think probably where the real future is going is, some combination of this, but also just improved frac design and efficiency. I heard Mark Zobach at Stanford say that, people who really understand how fracturing works understand that it shouldn't work. So there's just a lot that's unknown about why hydraulic fracturing even works, where the fractures are growing, how they grow. And so, there's been a lot of research and time spent on trying to understand exactly what's happening in the subsurface and how can you better use that energy to create a more designed fracture network, and how can you be doing it better? And then the other would be innovative drilling and fracturing techniques. Julio Friedman at Lawrence Livermore National Labs, I've seen a presentation he's given on controlled subsurface explosions as a future fracturing technology. And so improving the way that we drill and fracture these wells can also help in reducing freshwater use and reducing the amount of wastewater. And then I just wanted to touch lastly on the issue of induced seismicity. It's probably a topic that people have heard about. It's well known, and it's been well known for a long time, that when you either inject fluids underground or you withdraw them, you can cause earthquakes. And so it's well established in the scientific literature. The mechanisms are understood. The National Research Council put out a paper last year looking at induced seismicity potential for various energy technologies. And they looked at the known earthquakes or documented earthquakes that have been caused by a variety of energy technologies. And this also includes a couple new data points that weren't available when that was first published. So we now have seen induced earthquakes being caused both by hydraulic fracturing itself and by wastewater disposal. So you can see when they did their study, the largest earthquake that had been caused by hydraulic fracturing was a magnitude 2.8. Since then, a magnitude 3.8 earthquake was caused in British Columbia by hydraulic fracturing. And then at the time of they published this study, wastewater disposal had caused up to a 4.8 magnitude earthquake. Since then, researchers come out, and this has been somewhat controversial, and I think people disagree whether this was really caused by wastewater disposal, but in Oklahoma, there was a magnitude 5.7 earthquake that's been linked to wastewater disposal. Now, generally, these earthquakes tend to be relatively small. Often they can't be felt at the surface, and it's a relatively low risk because they don't, tend to cause property damage or human impacts. Although, this earthquake did. This caused some significant property damage and caused some injuries. So it is obviously a concern. The good news is that because the mechanisms for what's happening are well established, there are also a lot of methodologies for how you first evaluate what the seismic risk is and then mitigate those impacts. The geothermal industry in particular has developed these sort of cookbooks for how you evaluate, monitor, and then prevent induced seismicity. And so there's a good body of knowledge on what you should do to prevent these sorts of impacts. None of those have been incorporated into regulation yet in the United States. The only type of injection well in the U.S. where you really have to consider seismic activity is for carbon sequestration wells, the Class 6 UIC wells. And so that's been, sort of a challenge, is that we know strategies to prevent this from happening, but unfortunately it's not yet incorporated into regulation. When you're siting a Class 2 well, a oil and gas wastewater disposal well, operators do not have to take into account seismic risk when they're siting those wells. And so as we've seen, it's caused earthquakes across the country. And like I said, mostly it's low risk because it hasn't caused impacts, but we're starting to see bigger and bigger earthquakes, and scientists are also starting to think that maybe we just haven't realized until now that some of these earthquakes have been associated with wastewater disposal. Obviously, this is a concern for China. The reports we've seen so far is that the geology there is even more heavily faulted than the geology in the United States, and so it's something to take into account. So those are the main points I wanted to make. We think China's in a unique position right now. They're basically 10 years behind where the U.S. was, so they have an opportunity to put in place a lot of these safeguards before extraction starts to happen on a large scale. They also have the ability to put in this modern infrastructure, where it has lower leaks, lower risks, and so we think, there's obviously a lot that they can learn from the U.S. experience. And then just briefly to give you a little bit of info on what NRDC has been doing, we hosted one of the many shale gas workshops in China last fall, met with industry, with members of the government, with academia, just started to talk about some of these issues. What can China learn from what the U.S. experience has been? We've engaged with the Ministry of Environmental Protection, working with them to hopefully talk about what some of these safeguards are, to do the research that's needed to see, what exactly should we be doing in China. And then engaging as well with academics and other NGOs working in China to try and start to sort out some of these issues. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, some applause here for... So I'm excited for both these people to come, but to have a scientist who could explain things clearly. Did you guys get it? I got it. Yeah? All right. Raise your hands, high and proud. And I think we'll have a lot of questions. I'll let you all have a few, and then I'm going to dive in. Okay,
Great.
Sir, and your name, please.
Dan King, a AAAS fellow at the Department of Energy. So I really get the barriers in terms of infrastructure, roads, and pipelines. And is it just the pricing regulation that makes it not attractive for the Schlumbergers and Halliburtons to seek out making deals with these companies that maybe don't know as much about the industry? Because it seems like there's a lot of technical expertise that could be quickly transferred in terms of the actual just drilling of the wells. And so I guess I don't fully understand the barriers to partnerships being developed between U.S. companies and these Chinese companies to kind of accelerate the development there.
Sure. I think there are two types of partnerships. The Schlumbergers and Halliburton, Baker Hughes of the world, they don't care if you produce gas. They go in, they drill the well, you pay them. So to them, it doesn't matter what the price signals are as long as someone hires them to do the job. And then there's the other type in the upstream that they have the production sharing contracts with, and these are the Shales and Chevrons of the world that are already partnering with the Chinese national companies today. And that's the point where the price signal needs to be a lot stronger. And people are doing it today because I think people see a lot of potential. But once you have to lay down your future revenue stream, the most important factor when you lay down your future revenue stream are prices and your volumes. And that's the part where the transparency is very, very poor. And you can assume certain price outlooks for your production, and you could be challenged left and right, especially internally when you're trying to make an investment decision. So that's where it comes from. I think when the board sits down and asks you, why are we putting our money down on this? That's when the challenges are starting to happen. How do you know gas price will be $10 versus $5? Right. So that's a lot of the challenges today. And above ground risks on the pipeline. On the pricing, none of those are easy to resolve. We often say, just build more pipelines. But the one thing we always emphasize about China today is that the industry landscape and the economy itself have become so pluralistic. There's so many different interest groups in everything. You'd be surprised in some of the deployment of new technologies, the interest groups that could come about. They just came out of nowhere. There are a couple of situations where the police force became part of the stakeholders. And why? Because there's traffic spacing rules on how many trucks can go on the same time when there's explosives in the trucks. And you need to sort those out. So whenever you get a complicated situation there, the obstacles are just left and right. And that's why we have a much longer term development. And, reacting to what Brianna said, that there's a lot more to be done on the environment side as well. 2 years ago, when we spoke with Ministry of Land Resources, we asked them, have you been talking to the Ministry of Environmental Protection? And answer was no. But the past year, we've seen a lot more collaboration between the ministries. So I think we have a lot of work to do, to get it right. But it will take time. So.
Can I interject about the partnership issue that? Because I remember when early on, like there was Ming Song from Clean Air Task Force, and I've talked to others saying that the Chinese government, telling me that the Chinese government was saying that they didn't want to let small oil and gas companies do this. They didn't want mom and pop, and they were interested in the companies like Shell and Chevron that had experience. But are they actual partner? They didn't get to bid on any of the plays. They're just, I mean, is it joint ventures?
They cannot bid. So the operator must be a Chinese company.
Okay.
And then they will, once they get the lease, they'll look for an international partner with them. However, the production is shared and all that's negotiated between the international partner and the Chinese company. Shale cannot go in and bid for a block today.
But then also these companies they're involved in the U.S. shale industry. And I was curious, do you want to say is there like some shares in Chesapeake? And is that also a useful mechanism for the Chinese companies to move up the learning curve on doing it safely and effectively in China?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think the joint ventures we've seen, Chinese companies purchasing shares in U.S. companies, that will over time allow for human exchange, for more technological exchange to happen. In the end, I think also depends on those agreements they have set up, whether or not it's acquiring stakes or production sharing, what's built into them in terms of technology transfer. So just because you own 50% of a particular company doesn't mean that they will give you 50% of their technology. So that's something each contract will have its own clauses in terms of technology transfer. But overall, I mean, then you can't, if CNOOC says Brianna will hire you for $1 million a year, and Brianna decides to go to them, there's really nothing that contracts can prevent that from happening.
Mm-hmm. Okay, some other questions out there. How about we'll do this side of the table, and then you guys get yours ready. Here, Jane, and then we'll. Oh, 2 fingers. That's what I thought.
Yeah, thanks. Jane Nakano with CSIS. So on the question of gas pricing in China, the experiment that the Chinese government introduced to try to liberalize the pricing in Guangdong and Guangzhou, it's supposed to be experiment, but I thought it might be replicated elsewhere a little quicker. What's your sort of perspectives or insights into how fast that experiment may become sort of the national trend?
Well, we believe overall the reform will spread because domestic gas prices too low today, and it's whether or not those linkages will push prices to untolerably high levels. So today, the linkage is proposed. For those of you that don't know, it's basically link Chinese domestic gas prices at the city gate. So before it goes into the city grid, with that of imported LPG and fuel oil prices. LPG and fuel oil are refined oil products. So that's effectively a linkage to global crude oil prices. And whenever you link an energy price to oil prices, the price tends to increase. Just because oil prices of all the main energy products are still the highest today. So the idea for the government is that a lot of the natural gas today is being used to replace some of the LPG, some of the fuel oil, and even diesel consumption. The natural gas should be priced in linkage with some kind of oil product. Now, you can put in different equations for that linkage. So what we generally call the slope. If it's a 1-to-1 slope, then it will, on a per energy content or MMBTU basis, it will be the same price as oil. Obviously, nobody's going to pay for that. Chinese diesel prices today are equivalent of $35 per million BTU. So those are not the prices people will pay for natural gas. But if you do a 0.9 linkage, which is what the government proposed, then that level will be lower. Sometimes you can go down to 0.7 linkage. And some of the global natural gas LNG contracts are also structured that way. It's linked to a basket of crude oil prices. So for China, I think today, with that 0.9 linkage, it's not sustainable. And I don't think the local governments and the end users will take that kind of prices. If that's actually implemented at $100 to $110 barrel oil, China will have one of the highest natural gas prices in the world. So what will happen, or what is happening today, is for the various stakeholders and interest groups, again, very important to balance all those, to reach some kind of compromise so that prices are higher than the regulated regime today, but lower than what you would see, zero point line linkage. But that overall should, if that's actually implemented nationally, and it's a done deal, then I think that could give the upstream producers some more incentive. But if we use a historical example, gasoline diesel prices were linked to global crudes in 2009. The law was passed in 1995. So it took 14 years for that linkage to actually happen. So we don't know how long this process hopefully will take, shorter than that. But this is whenever you get different interest groups starting to almost fight with each other, you get that kind of result.
Okay, I had one. Yeah, they're in the red.
Hi. My name is Virginia Cutchin. I'm an independent consultant. Thanks to both of you. Wonderful conversation, really informative. Forgive me if this is a naive question. I don't know much about this industry at all. But what I heard, one of the things I heard you talking about was fracturing activity causing greater and greater number of earthquakes and larger earthquakes. But the conversation I hear is that they're considered to be less significant because they're not felt at surface level, and there's little, if no, impact on human activity. But who's having a conversation about the impact on non-human animals and environments, and who's caring about that, and when does that start to be figured into the conversation? And the other thing I want to say is that I hear also a lot being discussed about cost and what things cost, and that being a major consideration, around activity that gets done. And I have solar panels on my house at great cost to me, but frankly, I would have paid more for it because of how it makes me feel with my relationship to the environment. So that's all. Thanks. If you could comment on that, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. So the report that the National Resources Council came out with is probably the most comprehensive report on that to date. And yeah, what they found is that generally those earthquakes do occur below the level at which they can be felt at the surface, but there are, rare instances where they are larger and can be felt and do cause damage. And so, like I said, our regulatory structure is really behind in what we should be doing about these issues. The USGS and I believe it's EPA are working together to come up with some guidance for the operators of these wells on what they should be doing. But I think it's mostly going to be operational and not really getting into the the impact side necessarily. The other concern, so there's obviously the concern for human health, for environmental risk, and for damage at the surface. The other risk is that these earthquakes could actually damage the wells themselves, which could then cause environmental impacts. One of the first documented cases of hydraulic fracturing itself causing an earthquake was in the United Kingdom. And what they saw there was that the earthquake actually ovalized the casing over several 100-foot section. And so, instead of being a nice round piece of casing, it actually deformed it. Now, they claim that didn't compromise the integrity of the well. That casing actually can deform. The bigger problem is the cement that sits behind it that isolates everything. That cement is actually really fragile. And so if you cause cracks in that, that can allow fluids to migrate up behind the casing. And so yeah, there are potentially significant impacts from these casings beyond just feeling the earthquake or the impacts of the earthquake itself. And so, yeah, we're encouraged that EPA and USGS are doing this work together. We hope to see them make that into something more formal.
There's no mic. Hold on, I think because Sichuan, yes, but there's no mic in that's on webcast. Here, can you hand her the mic real quick?
That's all. I just wanted to say, because I taught at Sichuan University for 2 years at the turn of the century, and Sichuan itself is earthquake country, and I don't understand how the risks can be minimized for a country that has earthquakes all the time anyway.
Well, one thing, if I can add on that because I actually a few years ago, we did a project on karst water issues in southwest China. You know what karst is? Think of, because you came to one of my meetings, the geology that it's like Swiss cheese. And so, and then a lot of the water that goes down, they have a lot of deep underground fast moving rivers. But I was curious, does the karst question, maybe you know this either in your assessments, does the karst geography, does it play a role in being good or bad or make more difficult or more risky shale gas fracking?
Yeah, so I mean, first on that point, what the research shows is that there is a very strong correlation between injection volume and duration and the maximum magnitude of an earthquake that you could cause. So essentially, the less volume fluid you inject, the lower magnitude earthquake you would expect to cause. And so that's why generally the risks from hydraulic fracturing are lower because it's a smaller volume of water injected over a shorter period of time. But obviously the wastewater wells pose a higher risk because it's a larger volume of water over a larger time, and so there's a very strong and empirical correlation between those two things. Now, the geology itself controls the probability that an earthquake will occur. But there are strategies you can take, which would include things like lowering the injection pressure or the injection volume if you start to see earthquake impacts. But it's something that has to be built into the regulation. It can't just be something that's left to be doing voluntarily. On the karst issue, it's definitely been something that people started to think about in the United States. Obviously, if you're drilling through karst geology and you have these huge voids in the subsurface, you could lose your entire volume of drilling fluid. You can't. It's difficult to successfully cement that casing and get the isolation that you need. It's definitely a concern. It hasn't been as big of an issue in the U.S. yet, but as drilling starts to expand into areas, like Ohio has karst geology. There's a play in Florida that people are starting to look at called the Sunderland. It's definitely starting to be something that's on people's mind. It could be, studies have shown, not related to drilling, but, you inject a dye at one place, in this karst geology, it can move extremely rapidly, to another place through it. And so if you were to get contaminants in there, it could be a massive impact.
But there are technologies. I think, Jane, you had me at a CSIS meeting, one of the first ones in D.C., actually a couple of years ago. You were cutting edge there, and some of the oil and gas folks are saying that there are technologies where you can actually really map this very well, but it's kind of expensive.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think the regulator's role is essential. If we look at when you were talking about RCRA and the Clean Water Act, my previous job when I joined CIRA was working with the EPA on some of the UIC underground injection wells. And one thing we found out through that process was, some of those regulatory authorities delegated to the states who may not be completely competent in doing the oversight. And when we went to the states to audit, that's what we found out. And that comes back to the China question, how strong is the regulatory authority on the environment front? And I think NRDC is doing great work, to try to transfer some of the regulatory know-how from this country to the Chinese authorities. The question, I think it's a very important question to tackle, but the technologies are there. If we decide that this is something we need, that we need this gas, that there's demand for it, I think that's something that the technology can resolve. And I have faith in the upstream industry to do this kinds of things, but there needs to be very strong regulatory oversight to ensure that all the standards is met and that the regulators are ahead of the industry in many ways. Unlike here, I think after the industry has already taken off, we feel like the regulator is actually catching up with the industry. There, I think there's potential for the regulator to be ahead of the industry today and putting rules that are already way ahead of what the industry thinks, because the industry is just getting started there. And it comes back to the question of how much do we need as a species in terms of energy consumption? What is our own choice of lifestyle? I think we often, and rightly so, put a lot of blame on the energy industry itself, but they're operating because we're using energy. They're there because everybody's asking for new resources. And if I think about what's happened in China the past 10 years, if the energy industry did not do what they did, the economy would not be there, the welfare of the people would not be there, and you would have blackouts everywhere. And I think it's a challenge that's facing the industry itself, but there are ways to mitigate the environmental impact from industry activities.
I mean, what's exciting for me, because, here at the China Environment Forum, we're a platform for bringing people together. And what's really, I think, good in terms of timing, you have well-established environmental groups like NRDC, WRI, and Clean Air Task Force that are starting to move on this issue. I think TNC is also trying to engage, and even the U.S. government cooperation. But what I don't know, what I'm trying to find out too, is like how robust like the U.S. government cooperation with China is on the shale in terms of the environmental regulations. That's not a question for you. It's kind of out there. I know there's talk, and so we have to kind of.
We have someone from EPA.
We have some EPA people about, but then keep in mind too that on the Chinese side, I mean, the MEP, Ministry of Environmental Protection, I gave a talk 2 years ago to a bunch of researchers underneath MEP about our water energy confrontation research, and I had some slides in Chinese, not as cool as her slides. Can I steal your slides, by the way? Thank you, good. But and in Chinese, and these were water and energy researchers underneath MEP, and none of them had even heard of shale gas. Okay, this was December 2010. And so there is a capacity issue of just even the research arm of MEP to catch up with, and I'm assuming hopefully that you guys are engaging with them, because it's it could be a very promising area of research. But then again, probably in China, I mean, there's like oil and gas university. I mean, there's probably researchers not in the MEP circle who might be the ones that need to be reached out to.
I think, well, a lot of people need to be consulted. It's a very comprehensive industry. The industry itself, they will organize, and I mean, companies organize themselves around the regulations and laws. And if the regulations and laws are not there, everything you do from an industry perspective to your management, you're trying to increase the cost of the industry, of our own operations. That's what management will tell you. So it is critical that the regulations are around, and then if it's from China Petroleum University, if they have the conservation and resource protection units there, these are the people that have to be consulted as well as part of the process, because they're the university, the feeder schools for the petroleum industry. And I think, after visiting them last year, it was apparent that they have the manpower to do it. But there needs to be a well-organized, overarching government framework, between the Ministry of Land Resources and the MEP and NDRC. Everybody that has stake in it needs to organize. And if we look at history, the track record is not that good in terms of intergovernmental collaboration. And it's not just for China. In this town as well.
The United States.
But if we, one panel I was on last year in one of the 1,000 shale gas conferences, we had myself, a person from CNPC, PetroChina, a person from the Ministry of Land Resources, and an academician from the Chinese Academy of Engineering. It was very obvious what everybody's position is. You have probably people in the ministry saying that we're going to open up the shale gas upstream to a variety of players. But then you also would have the national company saying that if you did that, it's going to be like the coal industry all over again. And if we look at the coal industry, it was late 90s, they liberalized the industry. The dominant players are now no longer dominant. You have thousands of mom and pop shops mining. And then that's when you start having contamination issues, pollution issues, and accidents, death, fatalities. And if you look at that track record and you think about shale gas, okay, maybe they should not open it up to everyone. And if we look at the people that actually won those blocks, in the end, they're all very big state-owned companies that I think the government would see as more responsive to government demands and will follow the regulatory regime better. So I think it's a process the government itself is taking cautiously, and they're sort of, touching the stones when crossing the river.
But then just to last thing on coal, and then you guys can talk again. That like coal ash management in China is not being done very well. I mean, because local government, there just isn't the regulation. But then Greenpeace had their study a couple of years ago, and I know that that things are in the work. But just mention, because so much of what Brianna was saying, a lot of the environmental challenges come actually at the wastewater management stage. All right, you guys can talk again. Someone has a mic, which puts him in charge. There you go.
Okay, Jin Song from Embassy of China. My question is that what's the most important experience China could learn from the United States in shale gas development, and could you give some suggestions to China government and China oil companies separately? And also, could I ask two speakers to answer my question separately? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think you get those. Those are both very broad questions, but I guess if you most important.
I'll be damned if I say it's not water, but
no, you can say it.
I think last week, I'll give you an example. At Zero Week, it's the biggest energy conference in the world, the Davos of energy. So we host that every year in Houston. We had a record number of Chinese company attendees. The Commerce Ministry, for the first time, sent 4 people there. And many of the Chinese companies there, traditionally get the national oil companies, but now we get more and more players coming. And many of them are trying to learn more from the U.S. experience. So one of the things that we were doing for them is partnering them, allow them to meet with the people that are doing the work in the Eagle Ford, in the Barnett, in the Permian, in that area, and allow them to establish these friendships and relationships with the U.S. companies. I think the key lesson today, I think the most important thing today is for them to have very, very open channels of communication. So on the part of the government, two governments, whether or not it's the environmental regulators, it's the natural resource regulators, or it's commerce, I think facilitating that kind of process of exchange will help make the industry that much better in China. I really can't single out one or two issues. There's too many. I had a table, and Brianna spent 20 minutes talking about just water and environmental emissions and protection. I think all of these issues have to be tackled with. I think there's potential for just failure on one could disrupt the whole industry. We've seen this happen in China, for example, the electric car industry. The Chinese government wanted to be a leader for the longest time and started deploying technology very quickly. And we've been saying for 3 years, all you need is one car catching on fire and burn to the ground, and then the industry will come to a halt, and then you'll have a hiatus for a couple of years when people go into the R&D mode again. And that's exactly what happened in Zhejiang a year and a half ago. An electric car, a taxi cab, just caught on fire and just burned to the ground in half an hour. So I think those are the things that have to be taken care of. Everything. It's not just a water issue. It's not just a pricing issue. It's not just some company failing to meet their financial objectives. I think everything will have to be worked through. Sorry, I don't have one answer for you.
No, but that is, but I think that is the most important answer, and something that, that we're even seeing here in the States. There's intergovernmental group on shale. I was poking fun at, but the U.S. government agencies are talking to each other. Former Secretary Chu of Department of Energy had that big working group. We're here in the States, it's like getting the state people and the regulators and everyone. Is NRDC, you guys are involved, like just on the U.S. side? More multi-stakeholder? I think it's happening here, and it makes sense that should be part of the China engagement.
Yeah, those things are starting to emerge now, in the U.S., obviously. And so, I would agree. It's so difficult to single out one thing that's the most important. But, one sort of overarching principle is just planning and preparedness. I think the U.S. was caught off guard by the shale revolution, and, we're still playing catch up. And so, again, China has this unique opportunity to get things right from the start, that encompasses every area, from the high level down to the detailed. So it's planning for how much water you're going to use, planning for how much wastewater you're going to generate, properly understanding the geology before you go in. And obviously that some of that information has to be gained only by drilling and experience. But, doing this planning ahead of time, not being caught off guard, I think is incredibly important.
So we have kind of our little that's advanced planning, regulation, and partnerships. All right, where else do we got here? I have to be nice to this side of the table for a minute, because you guys are just too dominant. But why don't you just pass it down? Why don't we gather two questions?
David Wendt, Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs. Mr. Zhou, you mentioned the pent-up demand for natural gas in China. Could you explain the drivers of those that demand? Is it transportation sector and the need for independence from oil imports? Is it the home heating sector? Is it chemical production? What are the drivers of that pent-up demand for this resource? Thank you.
And maybe pass it down to Jonathan there. Are you guys, who's Jonathan? Just the guy who's grabbing it.
So I'll answer that question first. The demand is from all those sectors, for sure. One of the reasons we've seen a lot of, traditionally, the industrial sector, fertilizers, for example, they're the most active in using natural gas as a feedstock. But the past 5 years was the surge in residential demand, the city gas companies connecting the city grid. In the old days, we were hauling LPG bottles up 4 flights of stairs, and that's oil product. So right, the prices are expensive for those. Today, a lot of big cities are connected to the city grid. The natural gas price is lower than LPG. You pay a connection fee. My dear father bought 2 years of contracts for natural gas as soon as it came through because it saves him that much money. So I think there's a lot of demand for that product itself. And then you have some of the emerging sectors you mentioned, transportation. In Sichuan already, the compressed natural gas, CNG, is used widely. But today, another emerging trend is LNG, liquefied natural gas, used as a diesel substitute. So like long-haul trucking that used to be burning diesel, a lot of the trucks are converting to burn LNG. It's cleaner, right? But behind it is economic incentive. Diesel is, as I said earlier, $35 per million BTU or above. Natural gas, even after distribution, you're maybe talking about $20 per million BTU. So a lot of the truck operators could get their money back in about a year for a payback period. So all those sectors, and then the most important one, the wild card, is power generation. Yeah. All you need for power is you have one combined cycle gas turbine up and running, and it can use up the gas of entire city grid. And the power sector today is only about, it consumes, I think, let me just see, 3 to 4% of power is generated using natural gas. So that's still a very small share, but it's emerging rapidly in coastal areas. So some of the, for example, the latest combined cycle units going to operation, Fujian province, that's linked to the Fujian LNG terminal that's importing gas at high prices again. So the demand is all over the place, and then a lot of coastal areas have resorted to gas-fired power generation instead of coal because of environmental drivers. People don't want to see a coal plant near them. So we've already seen a huge reduction in coal-fired power plant in construction because of that. I think 5 years ago, we were hearing China building 2 coal-fired power plants every week. That's already come down to 1 a week.
Yeah, how many did we build in the U.S. last year?
None.
So
that you know, a lot of the drivers behind them there is a fuel diversification trend behind the slowing down in coal-fired power additions, and part of it is natural gas.
When you said the replacement of that it uses diesel, I know that a lot of hotels and factories in China have diesel generators as backup. Is that? I'm sorry if I'm stupid, but do they also want LNG for those as backups, or
not really?
Not?
Those are becoming less useful as outage rates have decreased significantly. Back in 2003, 2004, it's nationwide blackouts. That's when all the small diesels started pumping along. But today, the grid reliability is fairly high. The generators, coal prices are relatively low, so generators are generating at pretty high hours. So that need is less now. It's diesel demand is still mostly road transport and then some industrial burning.
Okay. Good, thanks. Okay, Jonathan?
Thanks, and thanks for a terrific
Say who you are. I mean.
Yeah, sorry. I'm Jonathan Lewis from the Clean Air Task Force, and I really appreciated both the presentations. And to the point that you raised earlier, Jennifer, I don't have a sense of the full scale of government-to-government engagement, but I can just quickly mention, too, that the Clean Air Task Force is helping out. We're helping USTDA and EPA both develop platforms for engaging with Chinese government counterparts and with industry. So there is some of that going on. There's probably a lot more that others could speak to. The question that I wanted to ask comes back to water and water use reductions. Brianna presented a fantastic survey of the different techniques that are being or that can be used to achieve that. And Shale mentioned that you recently heard of a company that's reduced its water use by about a half. And so I'm wondering which of the different techniques that Brianna discussed might be used in China, which are most applicable to that space, and, you know, what the opportunities are for water reduction there.
Maybe you can. The one I heard about, the way they reduce is basically using more propellants like sands and gel. So that's something people are deploying here already, and Brianna mentioned that earlier. Probably you can speak more to that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's, you know, it's sort of difficult to say, you know, since obviously development is such early stages in China, and, you know, we obviously need to know more about what the quality of that water is that's coming back in China. But yeah, I mean, this is probably one of the hottest topics in the U.S. right now, and, you know, companies are popping up left and right who are offering new technologies and new solutions for reusing produced water, reusing wastewater, and so. Again, the exact technology that needs to be used depends on exactly what they're trying to clean up. So if they're trying to get oils and greases out of it, if they're trying to get ions, if they're trying to reduce the salinity, there's just a range of technologies. There's, you know, one I've seen recently where they treat it with ozone and UV light, and basically sort of, you know, cause reactions of those ions and then sort of break them apart, so you increase the solids content but you're decreasing the dissolved solids. So yeah, I mean, there's just there's a huge range of technologies that are being used right now, and it's just an incredibly rapidly evolving field.
And the water side, I think the Chinese companies we've been speaking to are very concerned about water usage, and in, you know, like last week, all the meetings we've had, water always came up, and they're highly interested in what some of independents are using in Texas. You know, what the ratio is between the sand and water, and how you can reduce water, and between what time frame, the risks with using gel. All those questions were asked intently. I think, you know, once the Ministry of Environmental Protection gets its grip on that issue as well, you're going to see the map itself probably requiring the industry to adapt certain technologies, maybe even mandate certain technologies to have more uniformity and ease of regulation and oversight.
Joe, in your conversations, since you're going to a shale gas meeting about once or twice a week in Beijing, Ministry of Water Resources, we have not uttered that ministry's name today. I mean, they're the ones that, you know, supposed to be allocating water. I mean, true allocations really in a big basin only really happen in the yellow, but, you know, in the basin, in Sichuan Basin, you know, there are dams being built, the far western South North Water Transfer Project, you know, that's kind of looming in the background. There's a lot of already existing pressure on water in Sichuan province, and there have been droughts. Have you seen the Ministry of Water Resources being pulled into this engagement at all?
Well, I haven't been to a shale gas conference every week, but so the Water Resource Ministry could very well be involved. I don't think I've seen them in a high-profile way in conferences or news reporting, but they could very well be in the back, especially if the water issue actually, you know, the 20 blocks that we're talking about here, none of them have started even working on the site. Mm-hmm. So everything is very, very early today, and the discussion, I think, with all the ministries is also quite early in their development. I think one issue on water allocation is that especially as we migrate northwest towards Xinjiang, it's very interesting to see the kinds of reaction from industry. There is a lot of heavy industry moving to Xinjiang today because of the cheap coal. And all of them are quite water intensive. And many of them are basically using coal gasification technology to convert coal to natural gas, to liquids, to electricity, to chemicals. And all of those processes require water. And every project owner will tell you that they have enough water. And then you add them together, you say to yourself, obviously you don't. And some projects won't go forward. You know, there are all kinds of ways to get allocated water, it's, one of the ways people say is I save the farmer some water.
Yeah.
I put in the irrigation system, and there's X ton of water saved from that, and then that X ton is allocated to me as industrial user. But again, if you start adding those projects up, it's very apparent like that the math is not going to work out. So I think the water allocation issue will be very important as well. Sichuan still probably less sensitive to that, but it's a much bigger. It's not just the shale gas industry that will be using the water you get.
There may be 1 or 2 cities. It's such, but that's just it. It's almost like I'm just looking at it as like it's like a slow motion clash of infrastructure, and you kind of think that, is there anyone up there at 30,000 feet planned? I mean, really looking at it through the water lens. All right, I'll shut up, sir.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. You mentioned the 70 areas where you've done the resource estimates and these 20 blocks that have been allocated. Could you talk a bit more about those and compare them to U.S. resources?
So I think one qualifier I would emphasize again before that is this is all pure geological work. It's before even any decent seismic work has been done. So this is all collected from existing geological data. So it's very early. Even that, I think it's used by most companies as a screening exercise, where they would like to go at least in terms of initial exploration. When we look at those 5 geological, where's the clicker? Sorry. Yeah, that.
There we go.
When we look at these 5 geological risks, we see huge differences between the Barnett and Marcellus and what we see in China. One of the things I would emphasize is the gas content and the kerogen quality. You see that in China it's towards lower end compared to some of the ones in the U.S. You probably would risk it between 4 and 5. So that means it doesn't mean that there's no organic content. It just means that on average it's lower. And what that would entail is you're going to have to drill more wells to find the high quality areas. And in the U.S. in the U.S. maybe drilling 5,000 wells and you hit it. In China you may need to drill 10,000 wells to hit it. And then imagine the capital costs associated with that. It's huge. So this is the area I think people are still looking at. We already seen some results after people have drilled and fracked. Just some of the key differences. But even, I think any characterization of the geology today is too early. 60 to 80 wells, that's just not enough for you to make an assertion about how good the quality of the gas is and the rocks are.
Okay, I can't tell if it's a 1 finger or 1 pencil. Is that a 1 finger? It does. She has it there. We're ping-ponging, and so we'll collect 2 questions, and let's do shorter questions if we can, because we want to. The interest is high and the questions are many.
Okay, so Kari Clark from Argonne National Laboratory. I have 2 comments and a quick question. The first comment on water treatment. There's an excellent report by the Bureau of Reclamation. I think it's a 2011 report that highlights, that goes through the multitude of technologies that are possible for water treatment and gives kind of an overview and an assessment. They're really interested in alternative waters and ways to reduce demand on their freshwater source. So that's a potential resource. The other comment on the lack of kind of federal guidance on induced seismicity, I just want to note that the states are responding rapidly on those areas. Arkansas has eliminated injection in certain areas based on seismic activity. Ohio has set up guidance on ways to minimize, similar to the induced seismicity protocol that the Geothermal Technologies Office at USDOE helped develop. But the question actually goes to this slide, so I appreciate you having it up. Could you go into a little bit more detail on the specific geological differences between or challenges that China's facing versus some of the plays here? It looks like gas content, so I'm guessing the EURs for the wells are a little lower, but in the karst geology was mentioned, but what are some of the other issues? Thank you.
Okay. And over on the side, did you have a quick question? to add to that? So we just gather two real quick.
Sure.
Okay, can you give him the mic? Sorry. Oh, he has one. All right.
Joel Kirkland with the publication Energy Wire. You had mentioned, sort of the defining characteristic of the U.S. boom is in some ways the number of wells that have had to be drilled for it to kind of really gain momentum. To what degree is there concern about displacement of people in China if this really got going in China, particularly in Sichuan province? And secondly, I apologize, but to what degree do you think the coordination between U.S. company or Western companies with the technology and the knowledge and Chinese companies, has to increase in order for this to really take off in China?
Okay, so we got
two different questions.
They're two different questions.
On the geology side, I'm not sure if I have more to share at this point. I think this chart shows there's a lot of data behind it. Assessing that this is just a 1 to 5 for ease of visual aid, but there's a lot of detailed number behind it for each of these criteria. Brianna might have a lot of insight on these actually, on what gas content and TOC and the kerogen quality means. I would just emphasize again that I think we're at a very, very early stage of really characterizing the geology. And this work today, even the kinds of data that go into this, there are a lot of gaps to get to this result. And those gaps we have to make assumptions. Our geologists have to make assumptions. And, Brianna, maybe you can talk about how in the when you're lacking data, what geologists would do on
right. I mean, so yeah, when you look at these spider diagrams for the U.S. plays, they all look different. And so there's really no silver bullet for what makes a shale play. You can make a shale play out of something that looks like this. You can make a shale play out of something that has a high gas content, good kerogen quality, lower pay thickness. I mean, it really is a steep learning curve for each play, and each play is obviously unique. The geology is unique, and so it really is about experience. I mean, it's really difficult to know whether these are going to be successful until you put the well in the ground, until you get the core out, until you start learning about it. And so, although the technology can be transferred from the U.S. to China, this knowledge is something that they're going to have to build up, for each individual play. And it's difficult to speculate until you really do start to get that information. And the U.S. also has the advantage that, even though these plays are new, there's already been a lot of drilling in these areas. So like the Permian Basin obviously is heavily drilled, and they've drilled through these formations for years. And so they know a lot more about these formations. Obviously, they haven't tried to produce out of them necessarily at this scale before. But, I think the advantage in the U.S. is that we already had quite a bit of data amassed in these places. And it was a matter of, collecting and aggregating it, thinking about it in a different way. But, in places where you're starting from scratch, it really is just a matter of experience.
And the U.S., I mean, that also brings up another potential gap in China, just the people and you alluded to it, that just don't have this kind of expertise. I mean. Yeah,
it's all new to everyone. So it's, when you're, as I showed on the other map, where is that? Here. There are areas that just have never been drilled in the past. So that's why the government, when they're handing out the blocks, those blocks are in areas that are less explored. So you're still at the very early exploration stage. You're trying to find where you're going to drill your holes and what the spacing requirements are. All those things are super detailed and it requires experience. So you could ask a reservoir engineer from the U.S. and come to China, but the learning curve will be almost just as steep because they have to figure out what's the best. Once you drilled a few wells, you have to realize every time you drill something, that's $6 or $10 million gone, and then you have to find the best strategy on where you're going to site your next well, and that's just a learning experience that only comes after you've drilled hundreds and thousands of wells in that particular type of geology.
And there was the question on displacement of people, because we have heard anecdotal evidence of, just not just for shale, but land grabs, and I don't know, because
well, in these areas, these are, these have anything that's issued by the central government generally pretty well consulted on the migrant issue. I think that's becoming very, very important. It could be a potential added cost. If you look at one similar industry, you look at is hydro power industry. if we look at the upfront capital cost of building a dam in this part of the country, unlike every other power generation technology whose capital cost is going down over time, look at solar, look at wind. This industry, the hydro side, cost is going up because of land prices and because of the compensation that's increasingly becoming very transparent for a lot of the people that have to be moved. So I think for the shale gas industry, it will be the same. They have to go into areas if there is people that need to be moved out of it, then there will be a lot of compensation regime that would be put in place, especially when it's very high profile, 20 blocks, everybody know the coordinates of where they are. I mean, you can go on Google Map today and look at if there's a village there based on those coordinates. So I think that's already there. The next question is whether or not if the central government starts to delegate the mineral rights leasing authority to the local and provincial governments, that could make it trickier. But today it's hard to see the central government letting go of that authority yet, just because we're at the early stage and there is issues with, not just migrant moving people issue, there's water issue, environmental issue that have to be dealt with. And the central government today, I don't think they have a full trust in local governments doing it yet.
And the pressure, and you had that final one that we kind of touched on before, the coordination on technology between U.S. and Chinese companies. Was that?
Yeah, just if it really were to expand, how much coordination needs to take place for that expansion to occur?
Well, to me, that's really that's a commercial question. Those blocks are out. I mean, the opportunity for joint ventures or partnerships are huge. And to see all of those opportunities going to a few international majors or the big 3 oil field service companies, I think it's very difficult. I think you're going to see more partners going into it. Now, there's a question of, some of these drilling companies you have in the U.S., it could just be 10 people in a company and we set it up. And if you're hiring these people to work with a multi-billion-dollar Chinese company, state-owned company, I would be a little scared just because how huge they are. I'm used to working with U.S. independents, right? But all of a sudden you're telling me I'm working for someone the size of Exxon. I think you're in a different country with very different regulatory regimes. I think you would probably think about it and see what the risks are. And I think, but that's something that if we look at the upstream industry, it's the industry is very well versed in risk sharing. That's why you see, despite the competition among the big oil companies, they still do joint ventures and partnerships because there needs to be a way to share the risk of upstream activities. So I think on the commercial side, as long as the momentum is there, people will be allowed in. I mean, it's not just shale gas. If we look at conventional oil and gas, other industries, international partners have been invited in for the past 20 years. If anything, it should be easier for these partnerships to be established.
Okay, we're getting to the end here. Brianna, I wanted to ask you a question about NRDCs. In the near term, is there another workshop going on in Beijing, or?
We don't have any other workshops planned in the near term. I mean, we have a whole team based out of Beijing who are really engaging on this issue. Right now, we're trying to focus on building up some partnerships, both within government, academia, and other NGOs, and really start talking about and thinking about what a regulatory regime in China needs to look like. What do they already have in place, and what needs to be added to that.
And are there any resources on your website that kind of talk about what you know so far?
Yeah,
and we'll post them on our website. That kind of
sure.
thing? Okay.
Yeah, I can send you some links. Yeah, but we do have our China program has its own website, and there's information there for sure.
And also for you had that nice little. Is that report that the little cover you had about? Is there public information you guys publish on this yet, or you're as public as it gets right now?
That's probably as public as it gets right
That's
now.
okay.
Before the money shows up in our accounts payable. we're a private company in the end, but we're happy to share the information. You know, I think in the public domain, a lot we've been talking about it. This is very important for us to have conversations like this. And maybe the way to start, I think, you know, we have these roundtables in Beijing twice a year for our clients. So maybe next time we'll get an RDC speaker to our client roundtable, so that there is some exchange with the industry as well.
See, the babushka in my heart is feeling good. Oh wait, did you? Is this a quick question? She's got a red dress, kind of like red leaf.
Just going back to your question about some of the commercial engagement as well as workshops, I'm Verinda Fike from USTDA, and I just want to give a very quick plug. We're actually hosting 4 workshops working with the National Energy Administration and U.S. companies, because in addition to the large U.S. oil and gas companies, there are a lot of small, medium enterprises in the U.S. that have been very active in this field, hundreds of companies actually. So these workshops are designed to basically facilitate just a platform for these U.S. companies to create partnerships with these new winners of the shale blocks in China. So the first of these workshops is happening April 23rd and 24th in Chengdu, and that's going to be focused on resource characterization and assessment. And the second workshop will probably take place in July with the Environmental Industries Forum. That'll be focused on environmental technologies. So at the government level, we are actively trying to create spaces for these partnerships to coalesce. So just wanted to give a quick plug. Thanks.
Sorry, you were in that dark corner, and I couldn't in the lights. I didn't see that you were there. But is there anyone else from USG or elsewhere that wants to throw in what they're doing in the near term with Shale China? Or we'll say I'm gonna have to have more meetings. Applause for these speakers, please. And I want to say that, again, I have to thank my Blue Moon Fund, Rockefeller Brother Fund, Vermont Law School, USAID, and Skoll Global Threats Fund that supports my water energy stuff here at the Wilson Center. And also, we had a problem with getting the invite out, but for those of you in town here, on the 25th at 2 o'clock, we talked about dams here today. We have a dam meeting. DAM, looking at Mekong, about it's about how some lower basin Mekong are engaging with Chinese partners on the dam building there. So come on down for that as well, relevant to the shale issue indirectly. So again, thanks a lot, and thank you guys again. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Didn't mean to put you on because I saw the problem. Is there anything?
It's great. It helps us market.
Thank you.
Good
to see you, my friend.
Across the table. I do, yeah. Let me grab one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I thought